In a world where mornings often begin with silent battles and unseen pressure, one believer wakes up feeling utterly empty, caught between chaos, doubt, and a desperate need for God. But what starts as a quiet cry in the darkness becomes a supernatural journey that unfolds across the entire day and into the night. From spiritual attacks to divine interventions, from whispers of fear to overwhelming revelations of God's presence, this story exposes the unseen war for soul and the incredible power of prayer that turns weakness into victory. By the final dawn, the believer rises transformed, armed with unshakable faith and a destiny awakened by God Himself. As dawn approaches and the sky remains dim, a quiet tension fills the early morning air. What should have been a peaceful welcome into a new day instead becomes a reflection of the inner darkness lingering within the believer's heart. The stillness of the morning mirrors a silent spiritual conflict, one rising long before the sun has a chance to break the horizon. Reports indicate that the believer awakens with profound heaviness, as though unseen forces are pressing in from every side. Though no physical danger is present, the emotional burden feels alarmingly real, leaving them spiritually drained at the very start of the day. Observers describe waves of doubt swirling relentlessly through the believer's thoughts. These doubts whisper subtle lies, quiet enough to sound believable yet strong enough to unsettle the soul. It becomes clear that the mind has become a battleground where truth and fear wrestle for dominance. The world outside seems unusually loud and chaotic, amplifying the believer's inner turmoil. Even the smallest sound feels overwhelming, as though the external noise is echoing the storm inside. Everything around them appears distorted through the lens of spiritual fatigue. And yet, in the midst of the struggle, a gentle prompting rises from deep within. A single word, pray, whispers through noise, soft but unignorable. It is a call to fight back, a reminder that strength is found not in avoiding the battle, but in surrendering it to God. As the conflict between despair and hope intensifies, the believer reaches a breaking point. With the weight of doubt pressing harder than ever, they release a desperate cry for God's presence, one that carries the raw honesty of a soul longing to be rescued from the shadows before the day even begins. In the aftermath of the believer's desperate cry for God's presence, the atmosphere inside the quiet room reportedly began to shift. What moments earlier felt suffocating and heavy now carried a faint sense of movement, subtle, gentle, yet undeniably real. Investigators observing the scene described a change, as though the very air had started responding to the cry from a believer's heart. Sources say the believer remained kneeling, shoulders trembling not from fear this time, but from an unexpected warmth brushing softly through the room. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something sacred awakening. After the emotional storm of doubt, this sudden calm was both startling and deeply comforting. Eyewitness accounts note that the believer's breathing slowed, matching the careful quiet that now filled the space. Gone was the suffocating darkness of a few moments ago. In its place stood a fragile peace, delicate, but strong enough to steady the believer's trembling spirit. It was as if heaven had leaned closer to listen. Reports indicate that long-forgotten scriptures began resurfacing in the believer's memory. Verses once read casually now echoed with new life. Promises of strength, protection, and God's unchanging presence. These reminders didn't arrive with force, but rather as gentle nudges, rekindling a faith that had nearly faded at dawn. Analysts described this moment as a significant turning point in the developing situation. The doubts that previously flooded the believer's mind did not vanish instantly, but their grip noticeably weakened. For the first time since waking, the believer sensed they were not fighting alone. Multiple accounts suggest the believer felt the Holy Spirit stirring, quietly but unmistakably. The weight pressing on their chest slowly lifted, replaced by a sense of being held, supported, and understood. This subtle spiritual intervention brought a renewed awareness. God had heard the cry from chapter 1. The emotional atmosphere became increasingly charged, though not with fear as before. Instead, witnesses describe it as a rising internal strength, a small flame beginning to burn in the believer's chest. That flame grew brighter with each breath, signaling a return of spiritual clarity. This shift reportedly inspired the believer to whisper a simple phrase, one barely audible yet filled with sincerity. "Lord, I feel you." The moment the words were spoken, The room seemed to settle even more, as though acknowledging connection now formed between heaven and the weary heart. Experts analyzing the scene emphasized that the believer had not yet fully recovered. The struggle was still real, but optimism emerged where despair once ruled. This chapter reveals the first true movement toward victory, a spiritual awakening sparked by one desperate cry. Following the quiet but unmistakable stirring of the Spirit reported in Chapter 2, new developments indicate that the believer's internal atmosphere shifted from fragile calm to gathering courage. Sources describe the individual lifting their head slowly, as though sensing that the moment for silent endurance had passed. What was once a whisper of strength now began rising with purpose. Observers at the scene note that the believer's hands, which trembled only moments earlier, steadied with surprising resolve. The lingering warmth of God's presence seemed to brace their spirit from within. Witnesses believe this shift marked the exact moment the believer understood that staying silent was no longer an option. This was the hour to speak. Reports confirm that the believer began to pray out loud, their voice starting weak but gaining stability with each word. The previously gentle atmosphere now pulsed with authority as the believer declared truths that had long been overshadowed by fear. Every sentence spoken became a direct challenge to the spiritual heaviness that plagued the early morning. Journalists covering the unfolding spiritual event highlight that these spoken declarations carried unusual weight. Phrases such as "Lord, strengthen me," and "I will not be defeated," echoed through the room, cutting through the remnants of doubt still clinging to the air. Analysts suggest that this vocal proclamation marked a significant escalation in the fight for faith. According to those observing the scene, with every word spoken, the believer's posture improved. Shoulders straightened, breathing deepened, and their eyes began to reflect a clarity not seen since before dawn. The prayer seemed to activate something deeper, something that had been dormant beneath layers of anxiety and inner conflict. Specialists in spiritual dynamics described this moment as a surge of supernatural reinforcement. They report that the atmosphere became charged, as though heaven was actively responding to each declaration. Witnesses noted sensations of peace thickening in the room, almost tangible enough to touch, signaling a divine engagement already in motion. As the believer continued praying boldly, the previous chapter's fragile faith transformed into something fierce. The sentences became stronger, no longer requests but proclamations of truth and identity. "I am not alone. God is with me. Fear has no place here." These statements push back against every lie whispered earlier in the morning. Sources claim that unseen forces, previously felt as oppressive weight, began to retreat. The atmosphere, once suffocating, now vibrated with spiritual authority. Investigators describe this shift as a dramatic reversal of momentum, the believer now taking ground instead of losing it. In a powerful turn of events, witnesses say the believer felt an overwhelming surge of confidence, almost like spiritual adrenaline. This inner fire, sparked in Chapter 2, now blazed openly, casting out the last remnants of spiritual exhaustion. Journalists report that the believer's voice by now carried unmistakable boldness. Following the powerful declarations made in Chapter 3, new reports indicate that the spiritual atmosphere around the believer shifted dramatically once more. Although confidence had surged through the room, investigators confirmed that this awakening triggered a counterreaction, one last fierce attempt by doubt to reestablish its grip. The spiritual battle intensified as the believer stood on the edge of a breakthrough. Eyewitnesses described the sudden return of old fears pressing against the believer's mind like a rising tide. These fears, familiar and persistent, resurfaced with surprising strength. Past failures replayed like vivid scenes. Mistakes echoed like accusations, and unresolved questions swarmed the mind in rapid succession. Analysts believe this resurgence marks doubt's most aggressive push yet. Sources close to the situation report that the believer staggered momentarily under the mental onslaught. Despite the earlier declarations of faith, the emotional impact of these returning memories struck hard. The room, which moments ago pulsed with power, briefly dimmed as though shadowed by internal turmoil. This created a tense moment where observers questioned whether the believer's newfound strength would hold. Journalists covering the unfolding event note that the believer's breathing quickened, signaling the intensity of the internal struggle. Doubt whispered relentlessly, "You won't make it. This faith won't last. God isn't really here." These lies, previously weakened, returned with sharper edges, attempting to destabilize the believer's rising confidence. However, in what analysts describe as a dramatic turning point, the believers suddenly clasped their hands tightly and took a deep, steadying breath. Instead of collapsing under the weight of returning fears, witnesses say the believer met the internal attack head-on, their eyes open with renewed determination as the fight escalated to a new level. Reports confirm the believer responded with forceful, deliberate prayer. Their voice, now louder than in chapter 3, cut sharply through the oppressive atmosphere. Phrases such as, "I rebuke every spirit of fear, and these thoughts have no authority over me," rang through the room. The tone shifted from defensive to combative, signaling a decisive stance against doubt's final assault. According to spiritual analysts, each declaration acted like a blow against invisible chains. The oppressive weight began breaking, cracking, and falling away piece by piece. Observers described the atmosphere responding visibly to believers' words. The shadows seemed to recede, the air lightened, and a sense of freedom began emerging from beneath the tension. Eyewitnesses state that the believer's posture shifted once again, no longer strained, but upright and anchored. Strength flooded their being like rushing water, contrasting sharply with the earlier suffocation. With each forceful declaration, the battle moved further in favor of the believer, weakening the hold of every lingering doubt. Journalists report that in a climactic moment, the believer lifted their head fully and shouted a final, victorious declaration, "I am free." The proclamation carried such spiritual force that witnesses describe it as the moment the atmosphere snapped open, fully releasing the believer from the internal storm that had raged since dawn. In the aftermath of the believer's triumphant declaration of freedom, new developments indicate a sudden and profound shift in the spiritual atmosphere. Moments after the chains of doubt shattered, witnesses report that an overwhelming stillness descended upon the room. Not the eerie silence of fear, but the heavy, sacred quiet that often precedes something extraordinary. Analysts believe this stillness marked the beginning of a divine intervention. Sources observing the scene describe the space as becoming almost weightless, as though every worry and whispered doubt had been lifted from the air itself. Reporters note that the believer, previously standing in fierce defiance, grew visibly calm, their breathing softening as if sensing an unseen presence drawing near. The contrast between the earlier battle and this sudden peace was dramatic and unmistakable. Eyewitnesses recount that the temperature of the room seemed to shift not physically, but atmospherically. A warm glow, subtle yet undeniable, began to envelop the believer. It did not come from any identifiable light source, yet it radiated comfort, safety, and an overwhelming sense of being embraced. Investigators describe the scene as a moment suspended between heaven and earth. Journalists covering the event explain that the believer's posture changed again, this time not out of fear or battle-ready determination, but out of reverence. Their shoulders dropped, their eyes softened, and tears began forming without warning. It was not sorrow, according to reports, but an instinctive response to a presence too holy, too pure, to ignore. Multiple sources confirm that at this precise moment, the believer heard something, not with ears, but within the spirit. A voice, gentle yet infinitely powerful, whispered a simple phrase, "I am with you." Witnesses describe the believer collapsing to their knees, overwhelmed by the tenderness and authority carried in those 4 words. Analysts have identified this moment as the peak of the divine encounter. Observers note that the tears streaming down the believer's face took on a different quality. Tears not of fear, but of release. Burdens that had clung to the heart for months were lifted instantly. Years of unspoken worries dissolved. The believer appeared visibly lighter, their features softened by the unmistakable presence of God. Reporters described the transformation as nearly radiant. Sources analyzing the unfolding encounter report that an indescribable peace filled the room, thick, warm, and almost tangible. This was not the fragile calm seen in chapter 2, but a powerful, immovable stillness that seemed to anchor itself around the believer. The earlier battles now felt distant, irrelevant compared to the overwhelming holiness surrounding the moment. Journalists state that the believer, now fully immersed in the encounter, whispered words of awe and gratitude, their voice trembling under the weight of God's nearness. Every syllable seemed to echo with deeper meaning, carrying genuine worship, rather than mere prayer. This was no longer an individual fighting for faith. This was a soul held directly in the presence of the divine. Spiritual analysts observing the event highlight that this encounter was not only emotional but transformational. The believer's eyes, once dimmed by doubt and fear, now shimmer with clarity and renewed purpose. The warmth surrounding them intensified briefly before settling like a protective mantle. Witnesses describe the moment as receiving a spiritual covering, heaven's affirmation of strength regained. Following the overwhelming divine encounter detailed, new reports indicate that the atmosphere surrounding the believer shifted once again, this time from pure awe into a realm of profound clarity. Investigators observing the scene confirmed that the presence of God, which had previously enveloped the believer like a warm embrace, now began to guide their thoughts with deliberate precision. It appeared that the encounter was only the beginning of something greater. Sources describe the believer remaining on their knees, still trembling from the weight of God's voice echoing within their spirit. However, instead of being overwhelmed, the believer's eyes slowly lifted as though drawn upward by an unseen hand. Journalists note that this subtle movement marked the moment the divine presence transitioned from comfort to revelation. Eyewitnesses reported that a sudden wave of understanding washed over the believer. Questions that had caused confusion for months, perhaps even years, began aligning like pieces of a long-lost puzzle. Decisions once shrouded in doubt now appeared simple and clear. Analysts described this moment as a spiritual unveiling, where heaven illuminated the path ahead with startling sharpness. According to investigators, the believer placed a hand over their heart, visibly reacting to what they were sensing internally. Witnesses claimed that specific thoughts, unprompted and undeniably inspired, began to rise within the believer's mind. These impressions carried the unmistakable tone of divine instruction, gentle yet firm, comforting yet directive. Reporters labeled this development as the birth of divine purpose. Journalists covering the unfolding scene noted that the believer's breathing slowed again, but this time not from fear or awe. Instead, it reflected deep concentration, as though they were listening with their entire being. Observers say it was clear that the believer understood these impressions were not random emotions. They were assignments, calling them into a new level of spiritual responsibility. Sources indicate that the believer's face shifted from tearful awe to a look of determined understanding. Analysts believe this change reflected a critical realization. The battle they had fought through chapters 1 to 4 had not been merely emotional. It was preparation. The strength regained in chapter 3, the liberation in chapter 4, and the encounter in chapter 5 had all been leading to this revelation of purpose. Witnesses describe a noticeable shift in the atmosphere as the believer whispered, "I understand." Those two words reportedly carried a wave of acceptance, signaling that the believer was not only receiving direction from God, but embracing it. Observers confirmed that this acceptance marked the exact moment the revelation solidified into conviction. Journalists report a surge of peace settling over the believer, not soft and gentle like earlier, but firm and grounding, like a divine seal upon their newly revealed assignment. The believer's posture straightened, their expression sharpened with resolve, and the room once again seemed to brighten subtly as if responding to their spiritual alignment with God's will. Analysts observing the scene conclude that the believer stood at the threshold of transformation, with clarity replacing confusion and divine purpose burning in their heart. The believer no longer felt like a struggling soul, but like a chosen vessel prepared for a mission. This powerful shift signified a monumental milestone in the unfolding narrative. In the immediate aftermath of the believer receiving a profound revelation of purpose, opens with sudden intensification of the spiritual atmosphere. Investigators report that the moment the believer accepted their divine assignment, the room shifted once again, no longer filled with quiet clarity, but with a powerful, rising energy that signaled something extraordinary was about to unfold. Analysts describe this as the beginning of a divine anointing descending upon the believer. Eyewitnesses confirmed that an unexplainable warmth began to form above the believer, slowly descending like a mantle being placed upon their shoulders. Journalists on the scene emphasized that this warmth felt different from the earlier sensations of comfort. This was heavier, strong, authoritative, carrying the weight of heaven's empowerment. Witnesses described it as a spiritual fire with purpose. Sources observing the event detail how the believer instinctively bowed their head as the intensity increased. The air around them seemed to hum, vibrating with a soundless force that pressed gently yet powerfully against their spirit. Analysts believe this phenomenon represented the exact moment God began equipping the believer for the tasks and battles connected to their revealed purpose. According to reports, the believer's hands began trembling, not out of fear, but under the pressure of something far greater than themselves. The trembling quickly turned into a surge of power that radiated through their entire being. Observers describe it as though lightning were flowing through their spirit, igniting every dormant gift, every buried strength, every forgotten promise. Journalists covering the scene state that a wave of boldness swept through the believer, replacing the earlier humility with holy confidence. Their breathing deepened, their posture straightened, and a fierce determination lit their eyes. Witnesses claim it was evident that the believer was no longer just receiving instructions. They were being equipped with the authority to fulfill them. Sources indicate that during this moment, the believer heard a powerful whisper within their spirit, "I have anointed you." This statement, though brief, carried undeniable force. Analysts say it struck the believer like a charging wind, solidifying their identity, mission, and spiritual authority in a single divine decree. It was a moment of heavenly commissioning. Observers noted that the atmosphere became so charged that even the silence felt electric. The believer lifted their heads slowly, eyes shining with a boldness that had not existed in them before this chapter. It was clear that the divine power resting upon them was not symbolic. It was real, tangible, and already transforming them from within. Journalists report that the believer began to speak again, but this time with a voice filled with authority rather than desperation or searching. Phrases like, "I am ready," and "strengthen my hands for the work," poured out with conviction. Analysts describe this as a shift from receiving prayer to commanding prayer, a sign of spiritual empowerment taking full effect. Sources confirm that the anointing intensified one final time, enveloping the believer in an overwhelming surge of divine strength. Witnesses describe the moment as radiant, almost luminous, as though the very presence of God had marked the believer for the victory ahead. This final surge left the believer standing tall, steady, and remarkably transformed. New reports indicate that the atmosphere around the believer has entered its most dramatic transformation yet. Moments after receiving the divine empowerment, witnesses say the room seemed to expand with spiritual intensity, as though heaven itself was preparing to launch the believer into a new level of victory. Analysts confirm this marks the beginning of the believer's rise. Sources close to the situation report that the believer, once weighed down by doubt at dawn, now stood with striking authority. Their posture radiated strength, confidence, and purpose. Observers emphasize a remarkable contrast. The same individual who trembled under fear in the early morning now carried the poise of a warrior fully equipped for battle. The room felt like the threshold of destiny. Journalists covering the unfolding development describe a sense of momentum building around the believer. It began subtly, like a spiritual wind stirring, but escalated rapidly. Every breath the believer took seemed to echo with renewed faith. Every movement reflected the power placed upon them. Analysts compare this shift to a rising tide of victory, unstoppable and divinely orchestrated. Eyewitnesses report that the believer lifted their hands, not in desperation, as seen in earlier chapters, but in bold declaration. Their voice rang out with unwavering conviction as they declared, "I will walk in the strength of the Lord." This proclamation reportedly carried such force that the entire atmosphere seemed to respond, vibrating with the authority behind the words. Sources indicate that the believer then began pacing the room, speaking with confidence as though addressing invisible barriers. Statements of faith poured out. "No weapon formed against me shall prosper. The Lord goes before me. My steps are ordered." Journalists note that every declaration seemed to solidify the believer's transformation, anchoring their heart in unshakable truth. Investigators observing the scene describe a strange but powerful sensation in the room, one that felt like a shift in spiritual territory. Doubt, fear, and confusion, which once clung tightly in the earlier chapters, seemed completely absent. In their place stood certainty, clarity, and a profound sense of victory. Analysts assert that this moment represented the full manifestation of the anointing from chapter 7. Witnesses claim the believer paused suddenly, as though sensing something beyond the room itself. Their expression softened into awe, not due to fear, but because of what they perceived unfolding spiritually. Reports suggest that the believer realized their victory was not for a single morning. It was the beginning of a transformed life, one empowered to face future battles with confidence rather than despair. Journalists confirm that the believer whispered a final prayer of thanksgiving, acknowledging the God who had carried them through each stage of the battle. This prayer wasn't desperate or searching. It was steady, reverent, and overflowing with gratitude. Analysts emphasize that the tone of this prayer signified total transformation, from a wounded heart to a victorious spirit. Sources describe the atmosphere settling with deep, resolute peace as the believer lowered their hands. The spiritual fire that had surged throughout the previous chapters now rested within them like a steady flame, burning purposefully rather than wildly. Witnesses say the believer walked forward with the calm assurance of someone who knows God has already gone ahead of them. The echo of the believer's whispered prayer from the previous chapters still hangs in the air, trembling like a fragile thread between earth and heaven. The morning light has now fully broken, yet the atmosphere feels charged, almost electric, as if the heavens are leaning closer to listen. The believer's heartbeat steadies, not because the chaos outside has disappeared, but because something unseen begins to stir deep within. It is faint at first, like the gentle rustle of wind across quiet waters, but unmistakably real. A divine response is beginning to unfold. A sudden warmth pulses through the stillness of the room, brushing past the believer like a slow, steady wave. It doesn't erase the exhaustion or erase the weight entirely, but it pierces through the heaviness with surprising clarity. For the first time in hours, perhaps days, the believer feels something shift. It is not an escape from struggle, but the first breath of reassurance. Hope is no longer a whisper. It is a presence. It is near. It is alive. Yet even as this warmth settles, the forces of doubt push back with all their might. The believer feels an internal tug of war, faith rising, fear resisting. Memories of past disappointments claw at the mind, insisting that breakthrough is an illusion. The believer's hands tremble slightly, caught between surrender and self-protection. The spiritual battle intensifies, louder and more pressing than ever before. But this time, something is different. This time, the believer refuses to remain silent. With a trembling voice, the believer speaks a prayer, not polished, not poetic, but raw and full of truth. Every word becomes a declaration, slicing through the fog that once felt suffocating. The room seems to respond, as though every syllable gathers strength from heaven itself. The believer feels the ground of the soul shifting underfoot, as though old foundations of fear are beginning to crack. The simple act of speaking becomes an act of war against despair. Outside, a breeze sweeps through the early morning air, causing the curtains to sway lightly. To the believer, it feels symbolic, like the movement of God's breath entering the scene. The atmosphere changes again, this time with an even stronger sense of peace. Not the fragile peace born from perfect circumstances, but the fierce, unshakable peace that defies logic. The kind of peace that only descends when heaven steps into a battle no human can win alone. Inside the believer's chest, a strange boldness begins to rise. It comes slowly but firmly, like a lion waking from sleep. Spiritual strength rebuilds itself from ashes, breath by breath, prayer by prayer. Shadows of doubt retreat just enough to reveal the truth. God has heard, God is responding, and God is near, not in theory, but in undeniable reality. The believer senses that this moment marks a turning point, an invisible line crossed in the battle for the soul. Tears form, not from sorrow this time, but from overwhelming relief. For so long, the believer felt abandoned, unheard, and spiritually empty. Now, the presence of God feels so close that every emotion surfaces at once: gratitude, awe, humility, and renewed trust. The believer cups their hands over their face, letting the tears fall as freely as the morning light pouring in from a window. There is no shame in this release. It is healing. It is holy. Suddenly, the believer feels a thought drop into the heart, quiet but firm. You are not alone. You never were. It isn't imagined. It isn't wishful thinking. It is conviction, solid, anchoring, and profound. The believer senses this truth settling into every place that used to ache. Every old fear begins to lose its voice. Every inner storm starts to calm. The struggle is not over, but a believer now understands. God is fighting with them, not watching from afar. The believer kneels again, but this time with strength rather than desperation. The prayer that flows now is different, no longer a cry for survival, but a declaration of confidence. The believer calls out promises remembered, scriptures buried deep in the heart. The renewed strength from the previous chapter follows a believer like a glowing ember, warm yet fragile. As the day begins to unfold, though the spiritual heaviness is lifted, the air still carries the unmistakable sense that something larger is taking shape, something unfolding not just around the believer, but within. The morning feels different, charged with divine intention. Every sound, every ray of light, every breath seems to announce, God is moving. But as a believer takes the first steps into the day, the enemy attempts one final ambush. Old lies return, sharp and sudden, the kind that once crippled a heart. You're still weak, they whisper. This peace won't last. For a moment, the believer pauses, feeling the sting of those familiar shadows. Yet this time, the reaction is not fear. Instead, a quiet defiance rises. The believer recognizes those lies for what they are, empty threats from a defeated foe. The world around them begins to pulse with reminders of past struggles, memories of failure, echoes of past heartbreaks, burdens that once felt impossible to carry. Each memory surfaces like a wave intending to drown the newfound confidence. But the believer stands firm, breathing slowly, remembering the presence that met them at dawn. The peace of God isn't just emotional, it is armor, and it begins to shine brighter than the assaults of the mind. As these internal battles rage, a sudden moment of clarity breaks through. The believer feels a strong tug in her spirit, a prompting, unmistakable and urgent. Pray again. Not out of desperation this time, but out of alignment with what heaven is already doing. With eyes closed, the believer whispers another prayer, steady and full of conviction. The atmosphere around them shifts once more, as though the prayer has unlocked a hidden door in the spiritual realm. Then it happens. A sense of divine authority washes over the believer like a surge of wind. This prayer isn't gentle, it's powerful. It carries weight. Each word pulses with strength not their own. It feels as though heaven is speaking through them, reinforcing every declaration, fortifying every word. The believer prays against fear, against confusion, against every spiritual force that once held them captive. This is no longer a plea, it is warfare, and the believer feels victory rising with each breath. Outside, the sky brightens as the sun climbs higher. The room fills with golden light, illuminating everything in sight. To the believer, this light feels like confirmation, as if God himself is shining a spotlight on the moment, marking it as sacred. The shadows that once clung to the corners of the room retreat entirely. Peace becomes tangible, thick as morning mist, settling over the believer like a warm mantle. Suddenly, a deep sense of joy begins to swell within the believer, unexpected and overwhelming. It is not tied to circumstances, nor does it come from anything visible. It is spiritual, supernatural, and impossibly strong. This joy breaks through the heart like a rising tide, lifting every remaining weight. The believer laughs softly, stunned by the suddenness of it. Moments ago, there was fear. Now joy. Pure, holy joy. A sign that God is not only restoring, but overflowing. The believer takes a step toward the door, preparing to face the world outside. But unlike before, the movement feels different, filled with purpose. The believer walks not as someone surviving a spiritual battle, but as someone emerging victorious from it. The ground beneath their feet feels steady. The air feels fresh. The weight of God's presence remains like armor, impossible to shake. Yet before stepping fully into the day, the believer pauses one last time. A final whisper of gratitude leaves their lips, not loud, not dramatic, but sincere. Thank you for hearing me. Those words echo softly in the room, carrying a depth of meaning that only heaven truly understands. Everything has changed. Every prayer has mattered. And the believer knows beyond doubt, God has awakened something unbreakable within them. The believer walks out into the morning, carrying the breakthrough from the previous chapter like a shield of light. But as soon as their feet touch the threshold, there is an undeniable shift in the atmosphere, something stirring not only within but around them. It feels as though the spiritual realm has taken notice. The believer senses it instantly. This is not an ordinary morning. Heaven has moved, and the world is reacting. A sudden rush of noise from the outside world hits all at once. Voices, engines, footsteps, and a relentless hum of a world in motion. It's overwhelming, almost jarring, compared to the sacred stillness of the early prayer. For a moment, the believer feels a tremor of anxiety trying to creep in again. But this time, the peace within them doesn't break. It stands. It holds. The believer's breath steadies as they recognize that this noise is not a threat, just a contrast to the quiet victory they now carry. Yet as a believer moves forward, opposition rises in subtle ways. A harsh comment from a passerby, an unexpected problem at work, a message that stirs old wounds. It all hits back to back, as if testing the believer's newfound strength. Each blow is sharp, deliberate. The believer feels the weight of it, yes, but they no longer crumble beneath it. Instead, the trials become fuel for prayer. Every negative moment turns into another reason to cling to God with greater determination. The presence of God, which lingered like a gentle warmth earlier, now intensifies again. The believer senses it in every breath, every step. It feels like God is walking with them through the chaos, guiding their reactions, guarding their thoughts. Even when irritation tries to rise, peace quickly answers. Even when fear whispers, courage pushes back. The believer realizes something profound. The breakthrough wasn't temporary. It is active. It is living. It is growing stronger under pressure. Midday arrives with another unexpected twist. An issue that should have spiraled out of control suddenly resolves itself in a way that defies logic. Someone who was once cold and distant offers unexpected kindness. A problem that seemed impossible begins to open. The believer recognizes these moments instantly. They are not coincidences. They are fingerprints of God, small but unmistakable signs that heaven is still shaping the day. The believer pauses, overwhelmed by the realization that spiritual battles don't end at prayer. They continue throughout the day. But so does God's intervention. The believer feels a new kind of confidence rising, one that isn't rooted in emotion, but in experience. They have seen the difference between fighting alone and fighting with God. And now, every challenge becomes an opportunity to witness God's hand again. But the most dramatic moment comes when the believer feels the atmosphere shift abruptly. A sudden heaviness falls, almost like a spiritual fog. The believer senses it instantly. Another wave of opposition. This one is darker, heavier, more suffocating than the earlier whispers. It presses against the believer's chest, urging panic, discouragement, fear. Just hours ago, this would have crushed them. But now, something within rises with force. The believer stops, closes her eyes, and speaks the most powerful prayer yet, short, fierce, and full of authority. God, stand with me. Instantly, the heaviness lifts as if pushed back by an unseen force. Peace snaps into place again, stronger than before. From the first whisper of despair in the darkness before dawn to the fiery battles fought through the noise of the day and the revelations poured out in the stillness of night, the believer's journey has been nothing short of a spiritual awakening carved by the hand of God himself. What began as emptiness and heaviness transformed into warfare, breakthrough, revelation, and victory as God peeled back the veil and showed his power in every moment, seen and unseen, through doubt, attacks, whispers of fear, unexpected peace, divine visions, and holy strength rising in the quiet hours. The believer was not merely rescued but reshaped. And now, standing at the edge of a new dawn with the fire of identity burning in their spirit, they emerge not as a survivor of darkness, but as a warrior of light, stronger, wiser, bolder, and ready to walk forward with unshakable faith into everything God has destined them to become.